so let's get started building out this platform. I always like to have a clean work area, and I've already set up my little build mat there with all the screws and my tools and everything I plan to use. And I've got everything I need, and I'm going to follow the manual. According to what I got to do here first is I got to kind of cut this tie wrap off here. The reason why I got to cut it off, and well, first of all, why did they put it there? The reason why they put it there is because this thing will go and slide back and forth freely, and you could risk damaging it. So by taking it off now we've basically got this ready to start getting built and used. Now I had to kind of clip it off here a little bit. It was a very thick tie wrap, but not a big deal. Nothing a good old pair of pliers couldn't do. The next step here basically is you have those 5 mounts fixed to the bottom of that build plate, when in actuality you only have 4 that are fixed. Now the center one needs to get fixed to it. The reasoning why they had to do this is because now you have to center this plate in the middle, and there's already the nuts in place for you to do so. You simply grab 2 of those screws and you screw them right into that thing. I can't get over how well designed this whole platform is. I mean, geez, this whole thing is strongly made, it's simple, it's well thought out, and it's not that hard to build, really. I mean, I think if I wasn't making these videos and doing this stuff step by step at a slow pace, I could have been done in 20 minutes building this whole thing. It's simple, it's straight to the point, and it's not hard. One thing I do want to mention here is that when you're screwing this in, these bottom mounts, they are made of a hard plastic, or it could be ABS or something else. But you don't want to over tighten them too much. You could risk cracking or breaking these things. And the important thing here is that you shouldn't have to worry about that later while you're using the machine. But while you're doing this step, make sure you tighten them just right. I bet that a little bit of thread locker wouldn't be a bad idea at this step here either. I would also double check all the other screws you have on the platform, just because you never know. It might have jogged loose in transport. I already did that, and I saved you the ordeal of me videotaping myself and showing you, me checking when you can do it yourself. Just be careful when you do so, because some screws are meant to be somewhat loose, or they might be used as for the bearings or for one of the stepper motors, and if you over tighten them, you could mess it up and the platform might not work properly. In this particular case, when I did so, everything was fine. And here you can see an up close view of what I did. Isn't she beautiful? As you can see, I made sure not to tighten it too much. So on this step, we're going to go ahead and install the limiting switches for the build plate. So there's going to be 2, one in the front and one in the back. Now this is pretty straightforward to do. It's only 2 screws per switch, but I would be careful. The thing is that the connectors where the solder joints on the back of the actual switch itself, they go into the aluminum frame and there's no protection there. So just make sure that when you do put it in, it's not making contact with the frame. Otherwise it could short out. Now this probably won't hurt the controller or anything on the CNC machine, but it could give it a false reading and cause it to just kind of jitter back and forth, or not really know what to do, or not even stop. And where it could damage it is it might strip some of the screws on the platform, or maybe even damage the stepper motor in worst case scenarios, but I highly doubt it. Now this thing does take a bit of patience because it is at an awkward angle, but it really isn't that difficult. The other thing that I would make sure not to do is don't over tighten it too much, because you're screwing this right into the metal and it's just a PCB, so it's not made of steel. Therefore it could be easily broken, it could crack, it could break, anything could happen to it, and then ultimately you need to go and buy some more. The good thing is that if you do need to go buy some more, it's not really a big deal. These limiting switches are analog. They cost a few bucks at most, and they're easily replaced. Now Sainsmart doesn't have them, I believe, on their website, but if you just do a quick Google search, I'm sure you'll be able to find it, and worst case scenario, you just have a whole bunch. A good idea might be to have a whole bunch, because if you do plan on using this CNC device a lot, maybe they're going to wear out. However, I've used a lot of these types of things with these types of switches, and they don't really wear out that much, so I wouldn't really be too concerned about it. But that's about it, and once you have it installed, here's what it looks like. It's a very simple switch. The one thing I added was the cable management bracket there. Now I decided to show you this just because, well, It's a simple step. We're installing the cable management clips that come with the product. You don't necessarily need to install each and every one of these clips, but it is going to be handy if you install these that are underneath. Because once you get this thing put together, it's going to become a little unruly to flip it upside down, move things around, and get in there like you need to. What I did realize is later on down in the build, once I was doing this step where I need to organize the cables and wrap them up and tie wrap them, I wound up removing some of those clips, but I really didn't know which ones to remove until after I was done building it. But again, it's pretty simple. These clips, there's 2 in the front and I believe there's 2 in the back. And these clips are just pieces of plastic with a screw in the middle that screw right into the frame. So just like with the PCBs and the limiting switches, a good idea is not to tighten them too much. You will crack, you will break them. Now these switches inside, I later found out, are for running the limiting switch cabling underneath the platform to make it easy. Now outside of this, there's going to be a few more of these clips that we're going to install on the outside of the platform, and that'll probably be used for the stepper motor and maybe something else. You'll see later down the video how I actually did this and what I actually did. I believe I wound up removing a few of these because it just wasn't needed. It was a bit overkill, but again, it all comes down to how you organize your cables and what you do with it specifically. The way I did it, I mean, there's nothing in the instruction manual that says what to do or how to do it. I just kind of winged it and made it look good. As you can see, there they are, and it's pretty straightforward. Here's a close-up so you can see actually what it looks like on the interior of the frame and on the exterior of the frame itself. Now for this step, we're going to go ahead and use this plastic piece to align the screws and the nuts. The nuts are on either side and they're embedded into the frame already for you. So don't go looking for them, they're already there. Now, in some cases, these nuts may have slid forward or off to the side. Make sure that these nuts are towards the back of the lower build plate. The way you know which is the back is by looking at the stepper motor. The stepper motor is what indicates that back portion. When you're moving these nuts around, just grab one of the Allen keys and start shoving them left and right until they fit into that plastic jig. The key here is don't force those nuts. If it's not moving, shear force might move it, but it might also damage the frame. This is aluminum, so take your time. If it gets stuck, just jiggle it back and forth, up and down, and eventually that nut inside the slot itself will start moving again. So once you've done one side, you're going to go ahead and repeat the same thing on the other side. One of the tricks I learned just by doing this is I only aligned 2 of those nuts. I didn't align all 3. Now keep in mind, there's 6 on either side, 3 in the top and 3 in the bottom. As you can see here, then I went back and I just did the third. It was very easy. Just grab the Allen key and slide it right on back. That's how easy these nuts should be sliding. The other thing is, it is really snug in there. So no matter how much you move this thing, it's going to stay in place, which surprised me. This it should serve as an example of how well engineered this product is. They really thought it out. Everything is really tight and snug and fits just perfectly. Again, this is such a firm, solid platform, and having a CNC machine like this, the one thing you do want is for it to be super snug, super solid. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and mount the top of the frame to the bottom. Make sure that that stepper motor is facing backwards towards you, because that's the back, and make sure that the spindle is facing forward. That's the front. All you have to do is align either side with the bolts and the screws, and the nuts, and you're done. Take your time with this, and I would even advise putting some thread locker on some of those screws to make sure it doesn't move around. This is one of the structural pieces of the platform, and you want it to be rock solid. It's pretty straightforward. Once you do one side, go ahead and repeat the same thing for the back, and you're done. All right, in this particular step, we're going to be preparing the spindle and mounting it. Now, what wasn't entirely clear from the manual and the pictures is which way the collets went in. But you'll see that it only goes in one of 2 ways. If you try to put it in the wrong way, it just won't screw in properly. So you have to put in the tapered end first, then you can put the nut in. And if you want, zoom in on how I did that. And then once you do that, all you have to do is hand tighten it in a bit. I wound up just hand tightening it enough so it wouldn't get loose. you don't want to make this too tight right now, and you definitely don't want to over tighten this because you might wind up ruining the collet itself. So just hand tighten it a bit, maybe fix it a little bit harder with the wrenches that are included with the system, but don't go crazy with it. Now, once you've done that, you're getting ready now to mount this onto the spindle holder that's on the top of the platform itself. That's that plastic piece you see towards the center, and I'm going to bring that machine out so you can see it here. And there we go. So that little hole is where you're going to put that spindle. The nice thing about this platform, which is one of the reasons why I reached out to Sainsmart and I wanted to review this product, is because I can upgrade this spindle to twice the RPMs. I believe this one's a 10,000 RPM, and they have an upgraded version for 20,000 RPMs. Alternatively, if you don't want to use a spindle and you want to do something else, you can transform this entire kit into a laser engraving kit, which is kind of cool. Now, with laser engraving, I believe they have a 5 megawatt laser, which we won't get into the tech specs, but basically you can engrave just about anything you want, and you can possibly use it to cut thin wood, and maybe, which I haven't verified, but I'm going to verify, is laser etch on PCB instead of using router bits. That would allow you to be more precise and perfect. Now, if you notice here, I was making sure that this was properly aligned. There's a little padding around the spindle, and I just made sure that it was flush with the top. And this is more or less an eyeball. It doesn't need to be perfect. Remember, whenever you're about to use or do any carving or milling, that you're going to be using that sensor that we talked about earlier, which levels it out and tells the unit where it is within, with respect to the entire build plate itself. Now, one of the key things here is don't over tighten this either. It's going to tighten very well, but you could risk either damaging the spindle, the holder, or stripping the nuts that are inside the actual spindle itself. Also, those nuts are not embedded there, so if you unscrew those screws too much, it'll just fall out. Luckily, it's pretty easy to get in, even with my pudgy little fingers, but it's not hard. And there you go. Here's some close-up shots. You can see what I did, and you can see it's very well fixed. It does not move. This part was one of my bigger concerns. Not anymore. Now in this step, we're going to go ahead and install the baffles. I'm only going to go through one of the steps, which is installing one baffle. You're going to repeat that for both sides. Now these baffles, they're not structural, so you don't need to worry about it. They're just made of some kind of plexiglass or some kind of polymer, and they're covered in this paper. Make sure you keep that paper on until the very end when you're done building it. That way you don't scratch it up. It really does look nice and gives it a certain je ne sais quoi to the whole platform. It makes it, look very professional. The other thing is when you're actually going to put these into the platform, make sure you don't over tighten them. You will break the plastic. Again, they don't need to be super strong. Even if they're loose, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to impact the build at all. Now, what I did was I just installed it on one side. There are 4 screws that need to go in to actually mount this to the side of the frame. There are these special nuts that are designed to slide into the frame itself, and as you turn it, they will turn inside the frame until they get lodged in there, and they will serve as the mounting point for the baffle itself. What I went ahead and did was instead of installing those nuts straight into the frame, I just put the screws and the nuts right onto the piece of plastic itself. Once I do that, I align them to be parallel with the slots, and you can clearly see it because it's clear plastic, how that goes in. This took a matter of minutes, really wasn't that hard. And again, you want to make sure you install these straight on. You don't want to strip these screws. You don't have any extra screws and you don't have any extra nuts. This is all you're going to get. So just take your time with this. It takes all of 2 minutes. You could opt out of doing this altogether. I highly unrecommend that. I do not recommend doing that. Why is that? Well, when you're doing any type of milling, you know that you're going to get dust and particles everywhere all over the shop. Ultimately, you might still get an enclosure for this, but the more you have to protect it from anything, the better. Not only that, it's also going to protect the build plate from any external forces. Say, for example, if you're going, you're actually milling something or carving something out and you're working next to it and something flies off. It'll protect whatever you're working on. Secondly, remember, some of these bits, they're very soft and they're very fine grained, so they break easily when you're not paying attention. As you can see here, I only tore off the amount of protected covering that I needed in order to mount it onto the frame, because I wanted to keep these baffles nice and clean prior to getting used and abused by building out many things. Now this step was pretty simple. As you can see, I just lined it up parallel, I shook it a little bit back and forth, and boom, it slid right in. Really easy. I hand tightened them just a bit, and then after I hand tighten them a bit and make sure that they're in the slot, what I did was I push it up against the upper frame so that it's nice and flush. You don't have to do this. It doesn't really matter. This is just me being OCD and liking everything perfect. One of the things I did realize is that I screwed in those nuts a little bit too much, and it didn't allow it to slide into the slot properly, which basically didn't let me mount it in there correctly. Just go back, slightly loosen it such that it's not about to fall off, but it gives you enough space so that you can slide it into the slot and then start screwing it back in. Once you do that, then it's pretty simple. Again, I can't stress enough. Do not over tighten these. Tighten them enough. Don't wait for it to crack or crackle. Just tighten them enough till you feel good and you can see that the actual baffle itself is not moving back and forth. Now the nice thing with only having 4 is you can do 2 at a time. When you have something like 6 at a time, it becomes a nightmare to make this shuffle in. Sometimes, for example, let's say you have a spoil board that you're going to use on top of your build plate. It could get tricky if you have more than 4 you actually have 6 on your build plate. So if it's not perfectly aligned, it won't screw in properly and it won't mount properly. As you can see here again, I'm only hand tightening it. I'll go back later and I'll use an Allen key. Another suggestion that I have is don't use any thread locker. This is not a structural point of the platform. It's overkill, and some thread lockers could actually melt the plastic and break it. Ultimately, you can't even use the baffles anymore. Now, once you're done with this, I want you to go ahead and just repeat the same step for the other side, and you're done. Last but not least is make sure you don't grab the platform by this. Again, it's not structural. Here's a close-up shot as what you can see. And as you can see, those nuts, they don't need to be perfectly perpendicular to the rail. They just need to be snug in there and make sure it's not moving around. Okay, so now we're getting ready to install all the switches. These are the limiting switches that go on the platform itself. It's what stops each axis from going too far, either left or right, up and down, back or forth. Just like we did before, when you install these limiting switches, be careful. You know, the back of the solder joints of the PCB on the actual limiting switch, they're exposed, and you're putting it and mounting it onto a aluminum frame. It could short out if you happen to have it connected, and it could cause the CNC machine to react sporadically or kind of weird. Now, just like before as well, make sure when you screw these in, don't screw them in too tight, because you're just mounting a PCB, a bare PCB, straight to the aluminum frame. So if you screw them in too tight, you could actually either strip the screw or break the PCB itself. The good thing is, these are a lot easier to install than the other ones that we installed previously underneath the frame. They're not at the funny angles that we had before. Make sure you install this before you install anything else. Follow the instruction manual. Don't go ahead and install the controller first or anything like that, because then it'll be a nightmare to get this installed. Now, the good thing here is you only have to do 2 of these, I believe, on either side, on the left and on the right, because we've already done the bottom, and the spindle already has them pre-installed. So that makes this a heck of a lot easier. It's just a little cumbersome when you're dealing with pudgy hands like mine and gloves to get those screws to just sit in there while you try to screw this thing in. Now, the one on the right-hand side where the actual stepper motor is actually takes some standoffs, or some headers you can call them, and that's to give it a little bit of space away from the frame because of that stepper motor being a little more extended inward. The other side is just flush. So on that right side, you don't really have to worry much about shorting. Now we're going to be installing the controller, which controls all your stepper motors, your spindles, the switches, everything, and is what you use to connect to your computer, as well as the emergency kill switch, which will be on the right-hand side of the unit itself. Now, in order to mount this controller, the good thing is you don't have to sit there and fumble around with headers and standoffs to mount it into the plastic. It already came pre-mounted. But you are going to need to install 4 screws and nuts, which actually slide onto the back of the platform on the rails. Similar to the side baffles and how they slipped on, it's the same process. You have these nuts with these screws, and they're designed to slip in. Again, just like the baffles, this is not anything that is structural. So don't over tighten it. Don't use any thread locker. Just make sure that you put it on, hand tighten it, and make sure it's not moving around. The other key thing is you want to slightly offset where you install the controller. Don't install it in the center or all the way to the left of the CNC machine. You want to give it you want to install it over to the right-hand side of the unit on the back side. Not only that, but you want to leave maybe about, I would say, between 1 and 3 inches of space between the right-hand side of the CNC unit and where the actual controller is mounted. The reasoning for this is pretty obvious once you're building, but it might not be obvious when you're here. The reason is that you have a kill switch, and you also have one of the limiting switches that's going to be installed next on the right-hand side. So unless you have micro tiny hands that can fit into any crack and crevice, I don't, you're not going to be able to wire that up properly. You want to have some space. Not only that, but then you also have the stepper motor, which is on the right-hand side. That also needs a bit of space, so that way you don't have any issues with that. I was a bit concerned because this controller is just completely open, and I thought, well, what happens when I'm milling PCBs or doing aluminum? And then it hit me. PCBs don't have that much kick up. Aluminum does. But even when you're doing aluminum, you're usually going to be lubricating where that bit is. So all those dust particles from the metals aren't going to necessarily kick up, and therefore it should be okay. I may, in a later video, show how to upgrade that and protect it. But remember, this is where everything is going to get connected. Also make sure that the USB, VGA, and power ports are to the right-hand side facing that right-hand stepper motor. This is where all the cables are going to run in and out of. Not only that, but if you notice on the top there are 3 connectors facing upwards. They look white. There's also another one that you can't see. This is where each stepper motor is going to be connected to and where your spindle will be connected to. You'll see that in a later section. But for now, you can just see I'm slightly tightening this. I'm making sure it's fit right. What I actually did was I tightened it just enough such that I could still slide the controller around and eyeball where I want it to be in place. The manual's not going to tell you exactly where to put it, and you don't need to be super precise here. It doesn't need to be 2.5 inches from the right. It just needs to have enough space for you to move it. And as you can see there, it's nice and tight, and it's not moving around. I didn't go crazy again. Remember, don't over tighten it. This is mounted with plastic to the metal frame. You don't want to strip the screws. You don't want to break them out. You don't want to do anything. Just make sure it's there. And notice, again, if you forget, just look at the on and off switch. It's off to the right-hand side, facing the stepper motor. Now, on this next part, we're going to go ahead and install a few more things. On the previous section, we installed we installed some switches, but in this particular case, we're going to be installing the kill switch. This is a must-have switch for any CNC device. I've had others before, and they don't come with it, or it's optional, and I said, well, I don't need this thing. Well, I was wrong. Many, many times over. I don't know how many times I broke a bit. Now, bits today are fairly inexpensive. They used to be much more expensive, sometimes $40, $50 a bit. But in this particular case, they're not that much anymore. But still, you want to be able to stop anything you're carving immediately should something happen. And I love that Sainsmart includes this kill switch. It installs right to the side, right onto the structural part, and it connects easily with that. It works just like any other marine switch or on or off switch you've worked with. It's nothing fancy. Also, once you hit that stop switch, you have to just unscrew to reset it. Therefore, it's not a switch that's easily unswitchable back and forth. It's a one-way easy, one-way hard type of thing. Now, once you screw this in, again, just like we did with the baffles and the controller, don't over tighten it. You don't have to go crazy. Just tighten it enough so that it fits there. This is not a structural piece. It's just something to help you with the actual operation of the CNC machine. Just make sure it's in there nice and tight, it's not moving around, and as you can see, there'll be a cable left over. That'll go connected straight to your controller itself. It should have enough length to be able to do so. At this time, what I would actually do is, on your platform, make sure you check where the controller is in relation to that kill switch and its wire. Make sure that you can easily connect it and there's some slack. You don't want it to be too taut. Those connectors could come loose, and it could also be an indicator that you've moved the controller too far to the left where it shouldn't be. Again, here's the connector. It's pretty straightforward, and we're going to flip the platform around so you can see what it looks like. There you go. See, it's very simple. Again, this is important. You don't want a software kill switch. You don't want to have to turn off the power. You want to be able to stop what it's doing at the moment it's doing it. And this is a direct line to do that. Here's a close-up shot. One thing I didn't show, which is kind of boring, is where the actual cable management clips are, but here they are as well. So rather than showing you me wiring this up, it's kind of boring, I'm going to show it to you already wired up. So as you can see here, this shows every connection already wired up and ready to go. Every cable that's included with this is easily labeled. I did not add these labels. And it's pretty straightforward if you read the actual controller. Each connection will say things like X, Y, etc., etc. As you can see here, we have the X-axis connected, we have the Y-axis connected. It runs down my cable management, which I've already done and saved you the boredom of, and the Z-axis as well. You can see how that runs up. The Z-axis is actually where the spindle is. So that controls your up and down motion. And then the spindle itself, there's only one spindle, and it's labeled as such and gets connected to the spindle directly. On the lower left-hand side, you have your on and off switches, and then you have your kill switches, and you have also your limiting switches as well. These are important. I'm going to go ahead and take one of these out just so you can see how easy it is to put in and out. And that one right there is actually the kill switch. It wires directly into the board, and it only goes in one way, so you can't put or invert these in any particular fashion. One thing that I did find to be a bit challenging, is what direction do all the limiting switches go? That was a bit frustrating. Now in this particular case, I'm showing you the leveling component of the system, and that goes into the secondary port of the controller on the back. It's pretty straightforward. Now, when you get into the limiting switches, you're going to notice some things. They're going to say things like X negative, X positive, Y negative, Y positive. This was a little confusing at first because the manual only said one thing about it, but ultimately I was able to figure it out. And basically the positive is always facing towards the stepper motor that it relates to, and the negative faces away from it. It's also clearly labeled on the controller, so you're not going to have a nightmare trying to figure out how this gets connected. At the end of the day, these are limiting switches. So it's not going to completely kill the entire platform. It's pretty straightforward. Worst case scenario, you can always reverse it or whatever it is. Just make sure that when you do wire these up, you're wiring up with respect to what I said, which is which one goes where. The good thing is that these cables are a fixed length. They're not all the same length. So it becomes kind of obvious where each cable goes. If you have a slightly longer one, that means it's further away. If it's shorter, that means it's closer. So you really can't mess this thing up too much. Just make sure, again, you put it in the right spot. And before you actually do any carving or milling, make sure that the software and everything recognize it appropriately. Now I'm just going to go ahead and try to connect these back in there. It was a heck of a lot easier connecting these one by one, especially before I did all the cable management, which makes it nice and snug. My fingers are kind of nubby and small sometimes, but and chubby in there, but it's not terribly hard to put it back in there. As you can see, just with the fingertips, I was able to push everything back and forth. And again, I love the on and off switch. It's nice and sturdy. Now here's just a close-up of the kill switch. And I want to make sure it's just re-emphasized to you how important this is. I'm sure you already know how important it is, so if you want to fast forward, go ahead and do so. But again, it's easily connected to the back of the controller, and it's just a side switch. Don't worry about anything else. Now, as you can see, you push it in and you turn it to release it again. You push it in and you turn it to release it again. Now, one thing to make note of is that when you use the kill switch, you have to turn off the unit and turn it back on, making sure to reset the kill switch before, after it's been set, in order for the platform to work again. Now here we're going to talk about the brackets that came with the package. There are 4 brackets, and this is how you're going to use, what you're going to use to actually mount the building material to the build plate itself. Each bracket has about 5 pieces to it, and here's, 6 pieces to it. And here's a close-up of what it looks like and how to assemble it. It might not be straightforward and obvious. You might get confused or put it in backwards. So first step is just go ahead and take one of the screws and the actual nut and screw it in with the washer and get it ready. Once you do that, you go ahead and you take the other parts, which is the other screw, and you take the flat piece itself. And you're going to put that screw inside of that flat piece and screw it in nice. This is going to be adjustable later, so don't worry about it for now. Just put it in halfway. And then you're going to take the first screw that we took and slide it into the, there you go, into that slot, and put in that last nut. That last nut is what you're going to be using to slide it onto the build plate. Now, be careful when you actually screw it into the build plate because, again, you are dealing with aluminum and you don't want to do it too tight such that you bend and warp the aluminum itself, but it's pretty straightforward, and you'll see as it slides in, it's not hard to do. Now, what I actually wound up doing is I took the nut off and I slid it into the build plate because it was just easier for me to get in there, mainly because of the camera angle. If you're facing the front, not a big deal. And as you can see here, you just slide it in, fasten it, and you're done. Okay, so in this next step, we'll be installing the cabling for the stepper motors and the spindle. It's all clearly labeled, which is really good. Makes this really easy. You hardly have to follow any of the instructions in the guidebook, but I still recommend you do so. I'm going to segment the actual stepper motors from the spindle cables. That way I don't get too confused. I'm also going to separate those other wires, which are all for the switches. So the spindle motor is pretty straightforward. These are just connectors that you can buy at Home Depot that clamp on right to the spindle motor. Take caution when you're putting in these things. Sometimes they don't seat properly and you can't tell. Basically, you could either mount it between the metal and the plastic, which is what wound up happening there, and then I had to go back and re-put it in properly so it went straight into the connector. Now I'll be connecting the actual stepper motors to the controller. You can choose to either connect the stepper motors first, then the controller, or vice versa. Just make sure that whatever order you do it in, you connect the label side to the controller and don't connect the label side to the stepper motor. This way you'll know exactly what that cable is for and where it's going to be connected into the controller. So in this particular case, I chose to do the controller connectors first and then wire it back to the device I want it to connect to. So as you can see, I'm basically going step by step, looking at the labels, X, Y, and Z axis stepper motors. And then I'm going to go in and connect them properly to each stepper motor one at a time. The key thing here also is don't worry too much about how the cables are. You're going to have an opportunity down the line, once you're done wiring everything up, to kind of redo the wiring a bit and make it neat and fancy. You'll see later on down the road that's exactly what I did, which I didn't take a video of because it's really boring to just sit there and watch me do that. Now here you see me actually connecting the stop switch. The stop switch does have a jumper, which is what I put down over on the left hand side, and that jumper needs to be removed first before you can actually connect it to the controller. But once you remove the jumper, it only goes in one way and it's clearly labeled. You don't even need to look at the manual, but the manual does clearly illustrate exactly what gets connected where as well. So that makes things a lot easier. Another thing I want to mention here is if you're not familiar with wiring up things to a controller like this with these types of connectors, take your time. You don't want to bust any of these connectors. They are made of plastic, they are standard, but they can break easily, either on the controller or on the stepper motors themselves. They both have the same type of connection on there, and it's plastic, and it's got small pins, and it only goes in one way. if it doesn't go in, don't force it. You're probably putting it in reverse or backwards or whatever you want to call it. And take your time, understand how it gets connected, look at the teeth marks on the connectors and on the, on the female and the male side, and that way you know exactly where and exactly how it goes. Also, during this step particularly, you can choose to install some of these clips, which are used to manage your cables when you go to do the cable management side. Now, I wound up uninstalling these after when I finished doing all the wiring because I didn't have any use for it, and it was just 2 plastic clips sitting there on the side of the platform, useless. But I did wind up using the ones on the inside underneath the platform, and also some that were on the backhand side. They did come in handy. In this step here, we're actually going to now wire up all of the limiting switches. The nice thing, again, just like with the stepper motors and the spindle, is that each one of these wires is properly labeled. You will notice when you get your kit that it has an X plus and an XY, an X minus, or a Y plus and a Y minus. What basically that means is what side that will get connected to. The other thing is if you're confused about where that is, then no big deal. Just look at the length of the cable and it becomes obvious. So here I just looked at the length of the cable. Now you're going to have to forgive me here, but I actually used the wrong piece of plastic for that insert. So I wound up taking it in and out, and it wasn't easy to get in there once I had the controller there. Not to mention my chubby hands and the gloves didn't make it any easier. But what you actually have are 2 of those plastic slips that slip into those slots. The short one goes underneath your platform, and the long one is supposed to go where I just put that one. So I found that out later down the road when I was like, oh, wait a minute, I need to put these plastic things differently. But it was pretty straightforward. Another thing to be, aware of is the X minus, the X plus, basically the plus and minus signs on each one of these pairs of cables. Basically, what I realized so far is that the plus cable is the one that gets connected to the stepper motor closest to the controller, always. Then from there, you can figure out the rest. The other thing that you need to realize is always double check with the manual, because it might change a little bit, but I seriously doubt it. Make sure that you've connected it properly and it goes to the right spot. Worst case scenario, when we do the software setup and you get this working, it's not hard to swap this out and you're probably not going to break anything. You're connecting the right type of thing to the right type of connector on the controller. These are just the limiting switches that tell the platform when to stop. If you fear anything, like you've made a mistake when you turn it on, if you start hearing some grinding noises and it's not stopping, immediately hit the kill switch. That way you can stop everything and you can say, okay, what's the issue? Which direction was it going? So as an example, if you see it gets locked in the X and Y axis, you can stop it. Here are just some quick photos showing you some of these switches connected and how they look. It's pretty straightforward and simple. Now for the last step, all you have to do is go ahead and connect the Z axis limiting switches. Those were already pre-mounted, so I didn't mount them on there. You just connect them where they go. And again, it was pretty obvious which cable went where just by looking at the length and also considering the plus and minus, which one is closer to the stepper motor or not. From that, you can figure out where it goes. If you see again that when you connect the software to the CNC machine, that an axis is going in reverse, simply remove these switches, put them where they need to be, and that's it. Now, I have to basically sit here and rewire this whole thing and make it look something pretty. Not like this, but something that is presentable. I mean, you can leave it like this, but it's not something that I would recommend. This is what I wound up doing, and as you can see, I used all the cable management that they had in there. They have the nice wire wrappers, and that's the best that I could do for the time being. If I had more time, maybe I would go ahead and make a custom enclosure to hide some of these things. Let's see what's left over. The good thing about having the parts box is I can reuse it and reconfigure however I want. So over here we've got some tie wraps that came with the unit. We've got the cable wrap. That's really nice to have. If you notice, I took out some of the dividers and I reconfigured it so I could fit all these clamps, the screwdrivers, the tools, and I also had a few remaining screws if I'm not mistaken. Here's our trusty old screwdriver that came with the unit, really nice. I wound up having to use it after all because, well, my handle was too fat for it and this thing was just skinny enough to do so. I'm also keeping in my trusty wrenches. and I plan to keep this box close by. That way I can always use it whenever I need to. The great thing is, again, I have these little dividers so I can always reconfigure this box whenever I want to. That's it.